Welcome everyone to today's edition of EMS Focus, a collaborative federal webinar series. My name is Max Seberide, and I'm an emergency medical services specialist with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Office of EMS. Together with our federal partners, NHTSA's Office of EMS is focused on advancing a national vision for EMS. The projects we undertake and the resulting resources for the community help with systems improvement, measuring the health of EMS systems nationwide, and delivering the data that EMS leaders need to advance their individual systems. Another role of our office is to educate the EMS community on new innovations, processes, and technologies that can, in the end, help provide better and more efficient patient care. This free webinar series, hosted by our NHTSA Office of EMS, is a unique opportunity for federal EMS agencies and industry experts to share information with the EMS community. EMS Focus does conduct webinars several times throughout the year on issues that are important to the EMS community and provides you with timely information on what federal agencies are doing about them. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived on ems.gov for future viewing and listening. There'll be time at the end of the webinar for questions, but please feel free to type questions or comments using the chat feature throughout the webinar. More information on EMS Focus webinar series can be found on ems.gov. Next slide. Today we'll be taking an issue that is critical to our profession. Even in the midst of COVID-19, the dangers associated with ambulance crashes remain. It's critical that we don't forget that EMS-related traffic crashes remain one of the most frequent causes of line-of-duty deaths and serious injuries to providers. These crashes also cause harm to patients and the public. But there are actions you can take both every day on calls within your organization and at the national level to help make EMS safer for everyone. Next slide, please. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to highlight some of the reasons we're here. Looking at crash data, as you can see on the screen, from across the United States, we estimate that 4,500 crashes involving ambulances occur annually, with about a third of those resulting in injuries, including 33 deaths. Unfortunately, most of the EMS clinicians who were killed or injured in the crashes we investigated were not wearing seatbelts. In fact, 84% of those riding in the patient compartment were not restrained. Now, this data is a few years old, and we're working on updating it right now. Thinking about your own practices in an ambulance and those of your colleagues, where do you think that number is now? Are we still taking unnecessary risks? Do you ask your driver to stop so you can treat your patient unbelted and then buckle back up? Next slide. As for patients, most who were in ambulances at the time of serious crashes were not secured with both lap and shoulder restraints, despite evidence showing that both are necessary to keep patients safe. We'll be talking about several issues today, but don't forget that sometimes the most obvious and easiest solution is also the most effective one. In this era of COVID-19, when we tackle issues such as shortages of masks and gloves, don't forget that one of your most important pieces of personal protective equipment is the nylon strap and buckle that is always available to use. Wear your seatbelts and properly secure your patients. Your patients are counting on you to keep them safe. Next slide. Today, we'll hear from our colleagues at NHTSA who also work hard to keep us safe on the road by investigating vehicle and equipment defects, as well as ambulance crashes. They'll share details about what they've learned from these investigations. Most important, they'll tell you what to look for and when you can report information to NHTSA to make sure that a problem or potential issue that you see is solved not just for you, but for everyone. Keeping each other and patients safe is all of our jobs, and each of us can play a role in making sure safety issues are addressed before they put people's lives at risk. At the end, we'll take questions, so please go ahead and submit them through the chat feature of the webinar platform at any time. Next slide. Our speakers today are Peter Kibbett and Harold Herrera. Peter is a safety defects engineer with NHTSA's Office of Defects Investigation. He's been with NHTSA for more than 2 decades, leading investigations that have uncovered defects and led to recalls, saving countless lives. Next, Harold Herrera has led the NHTSA Special Crash Investigations Program since 2007. He first became involved with the program in 1989 as a crash reconstructionist with Dynamic Science, a NHTSA contractor before joining NHTSA full-time in 2005. Next slide. And now I'll turn things over to Peter Kibbett to start. Peter?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say I hope everyone is safe and in good health during these trying times. Again, my name is Peter Kibbett, and I've been working with the Office of Defects Investigations for a little over 22 years. I have rotated through just about every division within ODI, including screening, and then now I'm in the role of overseeing all EMS vehicles, as well as fire trucks and any support vehicles that's related to EMS safety. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk to you with regards to three very specific agendas that ODI has. One is the mission. The second is the safety defect investigation process and review and how we go about creating a safety defect. And then lastly, ODI's investigative process. At which point do we influence manufacturer and perform a safety recall, and how do we go about getting to that process? Next slide, please. The Office of Defects Investigation is made up of 5 different divisions that carry the actual investigative process of load. To the right, you'll see the heavy truck division is where the emergency response vehicles, as well as other divisions that are unique to very small industry vehicles that we have oversight on. Not only is my area of concentration with regards to EMS, but it's also motorcycles as well. The boxes you see to the left and the bottom are support divisions that aid us in performing our duties and tasks, that also evolves with managing investigations as well as recalls as they are substantiated throughout the course. Next slide, please. So the process of actually announcing a recall is more than just falling off of a spoke of a wheel. It takes a long process, and I like to throw this up there as humor, but the reality of it is that most investigations that we do open up may involve over a year in process. There's a process involved that we get information from the consumer. We then have to create a process to where we have to organize that information in such a way that we present that to our management, and our management then decides through a matrix, risk matrix, if it involves more resources and moving on to an investigative process. Next slide, please. The Office of Defects Investigations mission is based off of 3 different components. 1, identifying, design, and manufacturing defects. 2, making sure defect remedies are performed close to possible as 100%. That means that once a defect has been decided and manufacturers actually conducting the safety recall, part of our job is to make sure that the manufacturer gets to as 100% completion rate as possible. In addition, to make sure that the remedy and the timeliness makes sense, if you will. We want to make sure that the remedy that the manufacturer is doing is robust, is an actual fix, and can be used over many different platforms. And lastly, we as an agency, we have to make sure that none of the manufacturer's confidential material and or consumers PII, which is personal identifying information, are made public. We have to assure that the manufacturer's information that is identified as confidential stays confidential. And to that, we also have to make sure that the manufacturer or the public has exposure and access to the chronology and reports as part of any investigation that we do. So if you go to that last bullet, which is www.nhtsa.gov, you should be able to log on to that and open up any investigation that NHTSA has or ODI has. And from there, you could be able to go through and read any report that we have. All of this is public information, and we do a lot of work to make sure that anybody can go online and retrieve any of this information if they needed to. Next slide, please. ODI jurisdiction is more than just Corollas and Hondas and pickup trucks. We have a large reach from fire trucks to buses, to school buses. You'll see a picture down here at the bottom left of an 18-wheeler. We consider those heavy trucks. And when you see a condition where there's a school bus, it's mostly all hands on deck. That's certain vehicles require a lesser threshold for us to open investigations than others. And ambulances and fire trucks are right there with them. With regards to vehicle equipment, you'll see a picture of a scissor jack there. That's a component that we received a safety recall on in the past. So that falls within our jurisdiction. Also tires, you're probably familiar with the Ford Firestone issue that we had years ago. We have a huge outreach, and to that point to the EMS community, the striker cot that you see here, if it's part of the vehicle, if it's bolted down, if it's fastened, it falls within ODI's jurisdiction. That striker cot is something that we want to understand and know about if there's a defect involved with it. Once it's on its rollers and is out of the ambulance, that's FDA's responsibility. And we have a good working relationship with FDA and all other agencies that have oversight in the EMS community. And with that, we've also worked with Stryker and with Furno and with other companies to try and influence them to release certain information to the public, to make them aware of the pitfalls, if you will, of not making sure that you're creating proper maintenance and PMs for these particular products. Next slide, please. ODI has a process in which we disseminate information. Most of our information that we get is from the consumer or from consumer complaints. We are a data-driven agency. I need to make that clear, is that the only way that we can move forward on any issue is if we get information from the public. Now, I'm going to add a little bit to this slide in that most of my investigations that I've opened up with regards to the EMS community has all been, with the exception of one investigation, from contacts that I have been able to generate over the time. It's from guys in the service, field managers, techs, people that have called me up and say, hey, I got a problem here. Where does this fall in the world of defects? And so I would have that conversation with them. But typically, when we get a complaint, it goes through its process. It then gets logged into our system, which is the green arrows that you see there, and then the next slide, or the next bullet point, is then it comes to my desk. Once it's at that purple stage, it's in my inbox. I'm taking a look at it. I'm trying to figure out what's the relative safety consequence of this. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you. It will show there is a matrix involved. And where does this complaint fall on this particular matrix? If it rises to a certain level, then it moves on to the next process, to which I then gather additional information. I then reach out to the manufacturer, and then we have to make a decision. Do we go to a defect investigation process, or do we turn right, and do we continue to monitor this information? Do we wait on more complaints? That's always a balancing act that ODI has to have. We're constantly juggling these complaints and and figuring out where is the severity versus the frequency. What's the risk? And that is the crux of how we decide and determine of what we open. Next slide, please. So here's the risk matrix. Once we gather your complaints, we pair it up against this particular slide, you'll see on the left-hand side, there's severity ratings, and it goes from 1 to 5. 5 being if there was a fire that it burnt to the ground and it took out vehicles around. It was just a inferno blaze. So severity number 1 means that, okay, the consumer's complaining, but there was some smoldering involved. We looked at the part. There was no evidence of a thermal event. We're gonna continue to just monitor this. It doesn't rise to the level. But as we get more and more complaints, it shifts further and further over to the right. And if once it falls into the red category with multiple complaints, then at that point we decide, okay, this rises to the level of where we need to open an investigation. One of the emphasis that I want to make is that a lot of times the information is richer when I get it from the field. When I'm able to talk to consumers in the field that actually work on these fire trucks and these ambulances, the service managers, I get better information, which then in turn puts it further off into the red quicker. And so anybody out in the audience that that works on these trucks and fire trucks and these ambulances, if they get to a point to where they have a question about if this rises to a level, do I need to get a hold of somebody at ODI? Please do, because we can quickly disseminate that information and then move forward on possibly opening an investigation and getting some action done. You'll see a website that's located in this slide. I encourage people to be able to link onto this and then go, and then it explains this in more detail. I just don't have the time right now to go into this, but it's very informative, and it will show you exactly the processes in greater detail of how we negotiate this process. Next slide, please. So what is a safety defect? As it's written, defined for us, it is any defect in performance, design, construction, component, or material that results in unreasonable risk of crash or an unreasonable risk of death or injury in an incident. And that's a mouthful. But basically, we can all look at this and decide, okay, we understand what the design defect is, or what a construction defect is, or a component material. But what's a defect in performance? The bullet after that is where we talk about, even though a vehicle may fall within or meet FMVSS, which is Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, which is a 105 for brakes. All ambulances have to meet all of the regulatory standards as if they were just any other vehicle. There's nothing special that an ambulance has to work to outside of the realm of what is normally a FMVSS standard. I'm sorry. So if, for instance, you lose front brakes, but you still have back brakes, but the vehicle still falls barely just short and still makes the FMVSS standard, we still may open an investigation on that particular issue because there's a safety component that is failing. So just because it meets that standard, we still may proceed and move forward with an investigation. A safety-related defect includes non-operational and mission-specific vehicles. What we're implying here is that fire truck that you see there, that aerial ladder bucket, or that ladder, it collapsed. That fireman, the firefighter, was in that bucket when it collapsed and it fell on that building. And that is a defect. Even though that truck was not on the road, it was performing a mission, and it has to perform that mission as designed. In this particular case, we got a recall from that manufacturer on that bucket. But the problem that we had with this is that there was 4 other failures before we were aware of this failure, and the manufacturer fixed those other trucks as they happened. We need to do a better job of understanding when the first failure happens. There needs to be a little bit more of a community outreach. Hey, I had this problem. Who do I talk to? And it's me. I need to know about these problems so that nationwide we can get a safety recall that influences everybody that has these trucks that can get this recall. The ambulance that you see here that's on fire, that was a tip that I got from Dave Bryson. That was a 400 amp fuse relay that overloaded and caught on fire. We didn't have any complaints. However, when I reached out to the manufacturer, we were made aware of multiple failures, multiple trucks that burnt down. And so that brings me to my next slide. This is an opening resume of what an investigation looks like as we open one up. You may or may not, hopefully you could see that on the ODI side, there were no complaints. We had none, but as soon as we engaged the manufacturer, we were made aware of over 20 complaints and then multiple warranty complaints. So when we open an investigation, there's two processes to that. There's a PE, which is called a preliminary evaluation, where we confirm the complaints. This is an opportunity that we have for 4 months to where we can gather parts, work with the industry, contact peer municipalities, meaning that the person that made us aware of the issue, well, we ask for contacts that they have. And then we reach out to them to try and understand the issue in more detail. We document and summarize the information, and then hopefully at the end of this process, we can influence a recall. If we cannot, we either close or we upgrade to an engineering analysis. In the EA, at that point, we have a year-long process where we can do testing, we can do surveys, we can contact, we can purchase vehicles if we have to. And this also aids in the process of us influencing recalls or close an investigation. Next slide, please. What's important here is for me to explain to the EMS community is the outreach needed to open investigations. You see these are pictures that I've taken of different municipalities and places that I've been to that where I've created contacts and I've created relationships with people that have given me information in the past, and I'll go to them and say, hey, does this rise to a safety level? What's your opinion on this? I may not have all the answers, and I go to these constituents and I ask them for help. And there can be service managers, field reps, other government officials, fire chiefs. I've reached out to a fire chief on multiple occasions. Hey, I got this complaint that's about a fire hose. It's pulsing. What's your opinion on this? I need that feedback. Police officers and also EMT personnel. We opened an investigation because an EMT guy couldn't get in and out of the ambulance fast enough because there's too many things in his way. And it was from the manufacturer. So these are all issues that ODI needs your help with, and to identifying defects. Your complaint may be serviced by the manufacturer, even remedied by the manufacturer. And to that point, you'll say, okay, good, thank you. We're going to continue business as normal. But what we have to change the culture of is that your fellow colleague, which may be 500 miles away, could be having the same problem. And we need to get that person's product fixed as well. And the way to do that is under the umbrella of a safety-related defect. Next slide, please. This is another example outside of the EMS community of what a safety defect looks like. This is a jam nut that's on a 3-wheeled motorcycle. It cracked. We had 4 ODI reports. I opened up an investigation, and then eventually we got a recall. The end result is that the wheel could fall off. And this is what a defect looks like. This is stuff that rises to the level quickly to us open an investigation. Next slide, please. Here's another example of what a defect looks like. This is a total loss of steering as a result of a dragline failure. That is a ball joint that is supposed to be a lifelong, maintenance-free, service-free ball joint that failed. It was due because of corrosion and inserted and eventually deteriorated the inner pocket of the ball joint, and then it collapsed and failed and lost all connection. This truck ran off the road. Thankfully, nobody got hurt. We opened this one up on 1 report. So as you can see, the severity of which we open and close and we open investigations can fall into different areas. But what we try to do is we act quick on issues that we know are going to result in injuries or possibly loss of life. Next slide, please. And to that, I'm done. If you have any questions, please email me or contact me, and I would love to assist in any way. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And don't forget, as you're listening, if you have questions, please submit them through the webinar platform. We'll get to those in a bit towards the end of the webinar, but first, I'll turn it over to Harold Herrera to talk about NHTSA's Special Crash Investigations Program.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the EMS office for having us participate in this and be able to present our program, what we do. I am with the Crash Investigation Division, and one of the programs within Crash Investigation Division is the Special Crash Investigation Program, commonly, or we refer to it as SCI. I am the team lead for the program. Next slide, please. So what is Special Crash Investigations? We are the rapid response teams for NHTSA that cover the United States. The program began back in 1972 with 3 two-person teams and contracted field offices. I just noticed on the map there that there are only 2 offices with the stars there. There's actually 3. We have an office in Buffalo, New York, Bloomington, Indiana, and Mission Viejo in Southern California. SCI has provided NHTSA with the most in-depth crash investigation data collected by the agency. Next slide, please. The SCI program, we investigate approximately 100 crashes and non-crashes annually. The crashes are a priority interest to the agency, and some of the other offices that we provide investigations to, Peter was just talking about Office of Defect Investigations, and we provide numerous investigations to them. Our Office of Research, Office of Rulemaking, Office of Emergency Medical Services, and that's part of the reason I'm here, and any other office within NHTSA that has an interest in sending us out, or any other agencies. Currently, we're working with the Federal Highway Administration in conducting guardrail crashes. Cases are initiated solely on agency needs. And this is real important. Peter was talking a little bit about PII, and I know that when we interview people, they have a concern about this. But any case that we publish, it's made available to the public online, and we redact all PII, personal identifying information. Next slide, please. We have published over 2,000 cases, and they're available on the NHTSA website since 1997, and there are many more in paper format prior to us going digital electronic, which was way back in 1997. Over 100 cases are published on the NHTSA website annually, and all personal identifiable information is redacted from all published cases. That's real important. People are concerned about that when they speak to us. Next slide, please. What do we do for EMS in crash investigations we conduct for them? We started investigating ambulance crashes way back in 2001 through 2004 when we were contracted to conduct 6 investigations for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH. And since 2007, we began doing them for NHTSA's EMS office. To today, we've conducted 58 investigations. We've closed 4 investigations that we started, and that's sort of important because we've closed all those 4 because of lack of cooperation. We depend on the EMS community to not only notify us of crashes, but also help us by cooperating and allowing us to come in and inspect the ambulances. We do approximately 4 investigations annually. When we first started out, I think we did a lot more, but as we've gone along, it's kind of been reduced. Next slide, please. The question I always get asked is, how do we select cases and what's the inclusion criteria? The flow chart there to the right is a simple flow chart according to Dave Bryson that they have their decision tree as to how they select cases. But some of the criteria has been, and this was the first one here, ambulance and traffic. That was really early on. We took sort of a shotgun approach that ambulance crashes hadn't been investigated, so they wanted to capture everything in the beginning. And then the criteria is a little bit dynamic and it's changed. Was crash potentially survivable? Fatal injuries in the ambulance? Cot retention failure? And that one is sort of interesting because we identified, I think early on, that was an issue. The cots, especially in rollovers, were coming off the brackets and throwing people around. Was the patient ejected? Incapacitating injury in patient compartment, hospitalized for any crash-related injury. Rollovers is one that we're doing currently, and it's of interest. Fatigue, and any others that EMS comes up with. Ultimately, they make the call whether to investigate a crash or not. Next slide, please. Notifications come from numerous sources. NHTSA's Office of EMS, the bulk of them come from there. The EMS community. And the EMS community notifying us of crashes is important, but again, it's also important to us that they cooperate, or you cooperate and allow us to go in there and take a look at the ambulance, but also talk to the persons involved that are in the ambulance. We conduct an interview, and it's real important to get the information. We get notifications from law enforcement, our NHTSA regional offices, our CIS field offices. CIS is a crash investigation sampling system, and it's a sister program within Crash Investigation Division. They go out, they have, there's 32 teams across the United States, and they go sample police reports at numerous police stations, and they notify us of any ambulance crashes. Google Alerts, all our team offices have Google Alerts, and if they hear of an ambulance crash, they'll notify us, and we'll notify EMS. First responder links, you have numerous, they have numerous links, and Office of EMS monitors that and oftentimes sends us the links, and etc. There are others, and too numerous to list, but we get a lot of notifications. Next slide, please. This is an example of what we do when we go out and investigate. This was an actual case that occurred in July of 2016 in New Mexico, involved a 2009 Ford E350. If you can see on the lower left-hand corner there is where it was impacted by a vehicle and caused it to roll over. I think one of the reasons this particular crash was selected, there was a premature baby that was being transported, and it was inside an incubator, something I had never seen, and I don't think we've seen another crash like this before. Next slide, please. This is again the ambulance. It's involved two vehicles, the ambulance there, and a 2009 Dodge Ram. The picture on the left-hand corner there is that final rest at the crash scene. Next slide, please. There was a total of 7 occupants in the ambulance. The driver and front row occupants were both wearing their belts, and that's really important. We see that when they're wearing the belts, it really does mitigate injuries. There were 5 other occupants in the patient compartment area. That was sort of interesting to me, given that it seems like a tight fit. I don't know if I've ever seen another crash where there was 5 people in the back. The patient's mother was in the ambulance. The patient was a premature and unrestrained within the incubator, 6-week-old. That was anchored to, the incubator was anchored to a sled that was mounted to the cot. He was being transported from one hospital to another for emergency surgery. The EMT was the primary patient caregiver, and there was 2 nurses from the hospitals that were also helping out. None of the occupants in the patient compartment were belted. Next slide, please. This is, of course, the patient compartment area, but looking at this, to me, it seems hard to believe that there was 5 people in the back of this with the patient. But you can see the sled there on the cot where the incubator was mounted. The bench seat image on the right-hand side there, you can see the lap and shoulder belts or the lap belts there, and yet they weren't being worn. Next slide, please. And also, you notice there's very little damage to the inside of the vehicle there. This is the scene where the crash occurred, the lane of travel here that the ambulance was taking. It was at a 4-leg intersection. This was on a frontage road. To the left, you can see the underpass where the other vehicle came out of. And oftentimes, I think even at an open intersection, it's hard to hear. I know I've been at intersections many times where I can hear something coming, but I can't see it. So I think the vision was obstructed, even though it wasn't pointed out by the driver of the ambulance, but it must have been obstructed. The ram again was in the freeway underpass. Next slide, please. The ambulance driver stated to police, emergency light and sirens were activated. She braked, looked left and right, sounded air horn, saw traffic had stopped, observed the ram slowing, and proceeded into the intersection with a yellow traffic light. The ram driver stated to police that he heard the ambulance siren prior to seeing it, braked, but no time to stop. The front of the ram struck the right rear of the ambulance. The impact caused the ambulance to rotate counterclockwise and roll over a quarter turn and came to rest on its right side. Next slide. This is a schematic that we put together once we do our reconstruction. And you can see there on the lower right-hand corner where the ram was in the freeway underpass coming through there. And at the very top there, you can see the ambulance coming down and approximately where the impact occurred, rotation of the ambulance and where it came to rest. Next slide, please. This is a police on-scene image, and these are where the vehicles came to final rest. The ram didn't move a whole lot from impact, and the ambulance came across the intersection and again rotated counterclockwise and came to final rest on its right-hand side. Next slide. During the crash rollover, the top-mounted access door of the incubator came open and the 6-week-old child was ejected from the incubator. This is not the actual incubator. This is an exemplary one, but it was exactly like this. That you can see it has no restraints, harness or anything to restrain the occupant. And Max earlier when he said that most of the patients aren't harnessed or anchored to the cot or anything, this particular incubator didn't even have any straps, and so the child came out. One of the nurses, once he came out and was on the floor, one of the nurses located the 6-week-old and began emergency breathing procedures until first responders arrived on scene. She actually had fractured ribs, and it's incredible her dedication to this, that even with the pain, she was able to do that. The 6-week-old was transferred by air to hospital in another state and admitted for emergency surgery. Tragically, she expired 28 days post-crash, and the cause of death is not known. She'd suffered a pneumothorax during the crash, so it's unknown really to us whether it was as a result of the crash or not. There was, again, no autopsy performed. Next slide, please. So our conclusions, or what do we come up with on this? Both front occupants were wearing their seatbelts, and neither one of them was injured. I believe the driver went to the hospital just complaining of pain, but he was released. This was a good outcome in a rollover crash. And although none of the rear occupants were wearing seatbelts, they fortunately only sustained minor to moderate injuries. And the moderate injuries were the 2 nurses, I believe, in the bench seat suffered several rib fractures. One of them, the incubator actually struck her, and the other one struck some of the compartment area there. And again, wearing seatbelts has a good outcome in these crashes. And even though this one wasn't a very severe crash, it was still a rollover, and the seatbelts would have helped out a lot in this. Next slide, please. Once we conclude our investigations, again, we write up a technical report and we code the data into a database, and it's available. It's made available to the public. The website, the URL there is listed there, but you can Google it and just Google NHTSA crash viewer or crash viewer NHTSA, and you'll get to this page here. And the box there in red, the special crash investigations, the links, there's 3 links there that will provide you the reports and the data that we code into the database. These go by year, so the SCI crash viewer is the most current one. That any case that's been investigated from 2016 to today is published will be listed there. The other second link is any case done from 2004 to 2015, and there's a bunch of reports again, prior to 1997 and even longer there, that you can at least get the images from the crash, but there's not anything more than that in there. Next slide, please. So if you click on the top link for the current, and I went ahead and entered or queried for this particular case that I just presented here, it'll take you to this page here. And luckily, or good design here is that if you go to the case type there on the right-hand side, there's actually a box that you can filter for just ambulance crashes. So if you click on that and you hit the search button there, it'll list all the cases that have been published that are ambulance cases up to now. And again, these are current from 2016, I believe, to currently. Next slide, please. If you select the case, and again, this is the case that I just presented here, you get this tree here that at the very top of the tree, we code a database with approximately 600 variables, beginning with the scene inspection. We go on to the vehicle and inspect both the exterior and interior of the vehicle. And then we move on to any occupants that were in the vehicle and any injuries that they sustained. As part of the vehicle inspection, we also download the EDR, and that's made available to the public as well. And lastly, all the images that were taken are listed there, and you can actually view them. This particular one here, I blew up just to show what some of the field inspection is in here, because this was a rollover. They're measuring max crush there. And I believe this concludes my presentation. So again, thank you for your time, and pass it over to you, Max.
Great, thank you, Harold. We've received some questions, and so we probably won't be able to get to them all, but we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. Let me just pull up a list here, and before we pull that list, just wanted to mention that we have both Peter and Harold's email addresses up there, as well as the director of our Office of EMS, Dr. John Kramer, who also can be contacted. Should you guys have any questions about these types of defect-related issues with ambulances and equipment? First question, let me pull it up here. This is a question probably directed one for Peter first, and it's a question in regards to things in place to perhaps force ambulance manufacturers to supply repair items or supply sources to get replacement parts for things, especially after warranty ends, which sometimes is a matter, sort of you're left on your own. Maybe this brings up issues about NHTSA's relationships with chassis manufacturers, but maybe Peter, you could talk a little bit about these issues with how do manufacturers, how are they encouraged or forced to address these types of issues?
Okay, so thanks for the question. That's actually a good question. Some of these manufacturers fall under the minimal requirements to supply NHTSA with EWR data, which is early warning data, where a bigger manufacturer has to give us an aggregate format, their warranty with regards to steering issues, suspension issues. There's a bunch of different levels to that platform. But if I understand the question properly, there is a format where said manufacturers have to give us information. They're not obligated to tell us that it's a failure due to a broken part. They're just telling us, hey, we have 15 vehicles that resulted in a suspension failure, and here are the field reports that disseminate that information. But if the manufacturer does not fall within that 500 build threshold, which most of these ambulance companies do not, they don't have to respond to that or submit that information to us. I hope that kind of answered that question. If not, I can go into more detail based off of another.
Great, thank you. Maybe this might be another one for Peter, but feel free, either of you, to chime in. If an employee at an agency is filing a complaint to ODI, are there any protections in place to deal with retaliation, for example, under whistleblower protection laws? How do those types of issues get addressed or work for people as they report stuff?
With regards to ODI, there is a platform to where if a person wants whistleblower status, we do give them that. And that requires a person, I have a conversation with this individual. I then bring them, we have this chief counsel. We bring them involved. There's a legal platform to which these people are protected. But beyond that, in a general complaint, if you're filing with NHTSA, if you say, and it's written in the in the web outreach that we have of where you want to file a complaint, you say, no, I want to keep my personal identifying information. I don't want it to be exposed. There's a checkbox for that. And we take that very seriously. Your information will not be disseminated to no one. And no matter how hard somebody tries, they don't get it. But if you want further protection and you want a whistleblower status, there is that available. And I have used that in the past for a person that has worked for said manufacturer, but was concerned that there was safety implications for what he was doing or she was doing. Thank you.
Great. Just curious if, Harold, if you have any other questions or any thoughts that you think we haven't addressed so far that you might want to mention before we take a look at some of the other questions, maybe something that came up as you were thinking about the discussions today that weren't addressed by either you or Harold or Peter that you might like to mention before additional questions.
Well, related to the question that was just asked, we also take personal identifiable information very seriously. We protect that because we depend on people to provide us with information. Again, it's not only to notify us of crashes, but allow us to interview you and ask you questions, but we never identify who the people are. Even we have the FOIA process, Freedom of Information Act, that people will request information on our investigations, but we protect that and we don't identify any particular individuals or any individual by name, address. Hope that answers it.
I'd like to second what Harold just said. Our office takes it very serious, and I don't know how I can explain that enough. It's even if we're being FOIA'd, those personal identifiers are never released.
Got it. Thank you. I'm just screening for additional questions here in the chat box. One of the things that a question addressed, unlike school buses, there's a lot of variability in structural design, markings, visibility of ambulances from state to state, and even, frankly, within communities or departments. Can you talk a little bit about the consistency of sort of design standards? Is that something that the NHTSA agency gets involved with? Is that something that NHTSA doesn't really get involved with as it sort of correlates to approval of crash survival? I don't know if that's a good way to articulate the question, but maybe you could just comment on sort of, what does the agency do with these types of structural issues, sort of beyond just a single recall?
With regards to ODI, we do not have jurisdiction in those issues. For instance, when we were made aware of from Harold's group as well as emergency medical services, we have a lot of cots that are potentially cause an injury because they're failing in a certain way. We learned quickly that not all COTS are under the same jurisdiction and a standard, if you will, as, let's say, certain municipalities within different states. It's all over the place. We can't control that. The triple K standard, doesn't apply to every state, and not everybody is coherent to these rules or regulations based off of whatever funding they're getting. So it makes it hard for us to kind of dig in our feet and heels in certain issues. But we don't have a platform for that. I'm sorry. No. Harold, do you have anything that you?
Yeah, we don't have any enforcement powers, but what we do, our biggest thing that we do is we collect the data and then we present it to whatever office to see if they have enforcement capabilities towards that. As Peter mentioned, the COT issue, we saw it in several of the crashes that we did, and we saw an issue there. We're about to start what is called a move over, a study where police officers or not only police officer, but anybody out on the highway that get crashed into. But one of the things with regards to lights on those vehicles is that we've seen that the lights are all over the place. There is no standard, so we're collecting data, or we're about to start collecting data to see if that's a cause or not, see what works or doesn't work. So our main focus is to collect the data and have other people present it to other offices to see what they can do about it.
Great.
And to piggyback
Another question.
Harold,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to say, and to piggyback on what Harold was indicating, is that he collected a certain amount of data and presented it to us, and we tried to push that line as far as we could. Ultimately, we couldn't open an investigation, and we did not, but we worked hard with other municipalities, FDA. We got a lot of people at the table to influence these manufacturers, Stryker and Furno, to change business, to do things a little differently. We showed them the data that the emergency medical services have provided us, as well as Harold's group and NIST, the work that they've done, the crash data that they've done, and they kind of pushed the line a little bit more so that manufacturers had a greater responsibility to do more. But to Harold's point, no, we just gather information, and in that world, unfortunately,
great.
There's nothing much.
Another question, and this might be a two-part question. If you were an individual that wanted to make a report, is there a specific web link to the vehicle owner questionnaire? I think you mentioned it as a VOQ that maybe we could put in the chat window, or and then additionally with that, can you talk a little bit about how the decisions are made to investigate, maybe even just address if there's some liability risks that our agency holds, or is it all the liability on the manufacturers themselves? Maybe you could talk just a little bit about those decisions and how they're made on our end in NHTSA.
So with regards to the go ahead, Harold. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. They asked you about VOQs. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So with regards to the VOQs, which is a vehicle owner's questionnaire, I tried to actually copy it and paste it into the chat, and it just wouldn't let me do it. I was trying to do that, but if you go onto NHTSA's website, which is www.nhitsa.gov, there's the first page. It asks you, do you want to file a complaint? And if you click on that, it's a very easy and simple platform to click your way through. And I think in 3 total clicks, you're filling out a VOQ, you're indicating what your concerns are, and you're hitting the send button. And if you fill it out such that we get your VIN, your complete VIN, we will then know what kind of vehicle it is. Obviously, in this particular environment, it's going to be an ambulance, hopefully, and we take that VIN and it automatically gets disseminated to me. Your VOQ automatically comes to me. That's one of the things that we worked hard for in ODI is so that your information gets disseminated to the gatekeeper. In this particular case, it's me, really quick. And then, with regards to severity, I mean, if it's paint chipping off, then obviously, we can't do nothing with it. But if there is a complaint that substantiates, further resources, then obviously I'm reaching out to you. I'm calling you. I'm making that effort. What was the other questions? And maybe Harold can expand a little bit more on that as well.
I think that was great. Actually, I have another question that was posted, and maybe this is the final question. We're running close towards the end of the hour, and this one's for Harold. Does SCI look at things like the necessity of using lights and sirens during response or transport as a factor when investigating crashes?
That's not necessarily something we look at directly, but if during the course of the investigation that's presented as an issue, we document that. And anything involving a crash, we try to document just to see why the crash occurred.
Great. Next slide, please, if you would. Thank you all. I think that may be all the time that we have for questions, but we wanted to provide some additional information before we close. I want to remind everybody of a few of the resources that we have available. One is shown on the screen here, safeambulances.org. This is a website managed by the National Association of EMS Officials, or NHTSA, that has a lot of great information about ambulance standards and other topics. Next slide. Also, don't forget to visit ems.gov for more information about ambulance safety and links to other important resources, including how to report a defect to NHTSA and request an investigation of a crash involving an ambulance. If you haven't already, you can also sign up to receive email updates from the Office of EMS to make sure you're getting all the news about important projects happening right now, such as the revision of national EMS education standards, the development of evidence-based guidelines for things like pre-hospital pain management, and much more, as well as federal resources to help EMS respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. In a few days, you'll also find a recording of this webinar on the EMS Focus page, and it will be posted shortly on the NHTSA Office of EMS YouTube page. And I just want to take this moment to thank all of our speakers, Harold and Peter, and to everyone joining us today. We know that it's a busy time for all of you, and we appreciate all of you for your communities' efforts across the country. Thank you for all that you do. Stay safe, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.